invasion of Ukraine. It hasn't gone exactly according to plan because there has been fierce local resistance, but nonetheless, it is very evident that it's only a matter of time before big Ukrainian cities, Kharkiv, Kiev, and Kherson, fall entirely in Russian control. What exactly is Vladimir Putin's strategy here? What's his endgame? And more importantly, is there anything that NATO can do or offer by way of a negotiated settlement that will be a face-saver for both sides? Joining me now is one of the most renowned voices in foreign policy. He's a former American ambassador to the United Nations and, more importantly, former national security advisor to the former US President Donald Trump, John Bolton. Thank you so much for speaking with us here, Ambassador Bolton. First things first, I'm sure you're also watching in shock, in awe, the kind of pictures that we've been getting from Ukraine for the better part of the last week. What is your best assessment of what is it that Vladimir Putin is trying to achieve? What is it that he wants? Why is he going to such almost maddening lengths to invade another sovereign country?
Well, I think he has two major strategic objectives. One, which he forecast back in 2005 when he said the breakup of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, is he wants to reestablish Russian hegemony and maybe sovereignty over all or a big part of that territory. And number two, related to it, he wants to weaken NATO in a variety of ways. And the attack on Ukraine does both. You know, I think it's important. I've heard Putin say this. I've heard other high Russian officials give the kind of speech about Ukraine that he famously gave and broadcast for about an hour 3-4 days ago. And so I've heard the short version of it, but they are passionate about Ukraine. You can disagree with them, as the people of Ukraine do, but I wouldn't underestimate how strongly they feel about it. So in Putin's cost-benefit analysis, this may seem bizarre to outside observers, but I think to him at least, and so far the government, they view it as worth trying to do. I personally don't think he wants the whole country. I think as he sees the Crimea and a piece of eastern Ukraine in 2014, what he wants this time is probably a good part of the rest of eastern Ukraine, the culturally, linguistically, religiously Russian population, and he wants the northern shore of the Black Sea. He wants complete control of the Black Sea coast and landlock the rest of Ukraine. I think he'd like a puppet regime in Kyiv. That's why he wants to overthrow Zelensky. I don't think he wants to take control of the whole country. Number one, he's having big trouble doing it. Logistics have been terrible. Ukrainian resistance has been strong and heroic. But I think that he would like to get rid of Zelensky and put in a puppet and see what happens.
You were talking about getting rid of Zelensky and putting in a puppet regime. We had reports earlier today that Viktor Yanukovych, the former Ukrainian president who was famously ousted in the People's Revolution or the Maidan Revolution that happened back in 2014, he's apparently arrived in Minsk today. And Minsk has always been pro-Russian. Many in Ukraine believe that this is Putin's ultimate game plan. He wants to bring back Viktor Yanukovych. He wants to get Yanukovych back in the saddle, get rid of Zelensky, and have a puppet regime. But even if that's what his objective is, how easy or difficult would it be to sustain in this Ukraine, in this new Ukraine, given that the one thing that this war has done is to make the Ukrainian people rally around this government of theirs, and more importantly, rally against Russia.
Yeah, so that's why I think ultimately I don't buy the theory that Putin's got mental problems or any of the psychoanalysis that our learned commentators are giving. My experience with him for 20 years now has been that he's cold-blooded as you can get. And therefore, I think he will understand that the cost of trying to maintain control over a very rebellious Ukraine would be more than he could bear. So if he gets the parts that are largely pro-Russian by history and by culture, even if he has trouble, he can expel the troublemakers into Ukraine. I mean, I think he's got an easy solution there. And I think also you were right to mention Belarus, because Belarus is maybe priority number 2 for Putin in getting it back into the Russian orbit. And this is why countries like Poland, the Baltic republics, others in Eastern Europe are so nervous about this invasion of Ukraine, because they don't see it as a one-off proposition. They see it as a much larger threat in Europe. And I have to say, I think we need to look at this globally. I think in this what looks like a European conflict now. I think China has Russia's back. I think if we do what we should do and drive a stake through the Russian energy sector, I think China will try and take up the slack as a purchaser. And I'm worried it's going to work both ways. If China sees weakness in how the West handles Ukraine, I think if I were in Taiwan, I'd be even more nervous than before. And I think if China made moves to threaten Taiwan, that Russia would have its back. So this is something, I've called it an entente between Russia and China, to use an old French diplomatic terms. I don't think it's an alliance yet. It could become one, but it's something I think the rest of us have to worry about increasingly. It's not just a China threat in the Indo-Pacific. It's not just a Russian threat in Europe. It's both of them, and together in the Middle East and Central Asia.
I want to stress on that point, this possible coming together of Beijing and Moscow, and whether, the actions that are happening right now in Russia, the actions that Vladimir Putin has taken, whether that would in any way embolden Xi Jinping, basically looking at what's happening there and seeing what Putin is getting away with. There are folks who say that an attack on Taiwan, for example, will be very different from an attack on Ukraine, because the United States will be forced to respond differently. For starters, it will threaten the security of US allies like South Korea and Japan almost immediately. Also, we heard President Biden, I think it was a few months ago, where he said the time for strategic ambiguity in Taiwan is over. So do you reckon that if Xi Jinping were to take a leaf out of Vladimir Putin's playbook, then the response from America and its allies, but America in particular, would be different?
Well, I certainly hope so. I think the response in Europe has been strong, but I worry about Europe's staying power. And I worry how long, especially given their energy dependence on Russia, we're going to see this relative unanimity. Turkey, for example, not a member of the EU, obviously, but a member of NATO, announced today it would not impose the same kinds of sanctions on Russia that the rest of the Europeans have. So that's a huge gap in the sanctions potentially for the Russians. We don't have a clear view on Taiwan, as you say. I think strategic ambiguity long since has served its purpose. Former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe just called on Washington again to renounce it, and I think that's the right thing to do. But I don't think Xi Jinping wants a war over Taiwan. I think he wants it to fall into his lap for free, basically. And the question, and that's why he's watching what's going on in Ukraine very carefully. If he thought he could create an artificial crisis around Taiwan and the US and others would back away, he might be inclined to try and do it. But this is where deterrence can work. It failed in the case of stopping the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but I think deterrence can still work to prevent a Chinese assault on Taiwan. I think we should focus on that. That, of course, as you well know, doesn't solve the problem. China has a long periphery. And we've seen not major, but I don't think unplanned provocations along the line of control with India. The Vietnamese are continually worried about the problems along their border. So this is something that I think we're going to be concerned about for a long time.
I'm sure you, like many of us, heard the State of the Union address last night. It was Joe Biden's first State of the Union, essentially saying, and I quote, "When the history of this era is written, he believes that Russia would be weaker and the rest of the world stronger." What do you reckon, as far as Joe Biden is concerned, particularly after the catastrophe around the Taliban and the Taliban takeover of Kabul last year, how much is riding on dealing with Russia and Putin successfully, personally, for Joe Biden?
Well, I think there is a lot riding on it. I think strategically, as a global matter, if Russia's aggression succeeds here, and I've tried to define a moment ago what I think that success is, but if Russia gets away with it, if resolve falters, if the sanctions regime breaks down, or if there's chaos in Ukraine of the same kind we all watched on television in Afghanistan, I think Biden could suffer dramatically. And ironically, the political upside for Biden, if the Ukrainians won, unlikely, God bless them, they're doing a great job, but the upside for Biden would be small because Americans don't see it yet as directly affecting their lives. But another American defeat, in effect, I think would hurt him badly. And I think he's very much at risk, as are other economies around the world. Today, oil is at $110 a barrel. We've got 7.5% inflation in the United States as of January. This has an effect on everybody's pocketbook when they fill up the tank in their car, when they go to the grocery store. It's hurting Biden and the Democrats in the November election. I think he's very worried about that. And this crisis being sustained over a period of time, which I think is entirely possible, will just keep that pain going.
The response from the West so far has largely been economic sanctions, cutting off Russian banks from SWIFT, hindering the central bank of Russia and its ability to tap into its reserves, so on and so forth. And of course, there is the military aid that they've been providing Ukraine with. When do you think, or what do you think would be the threshold which, if crossed, then NATO will have no other choice but to get involved militarily in this conflict?
Well, I think this wouldn't be my policy, but I think the policy that Biden and the others intend to follow is only if there's a military attack across a NATO border. The sanctions did not deter the attack. The sanctions aren't going to stop the attack now because their effect is over a sustained period of time. But I have to say, I've spent a lot of time in public office working on sanctions regimes against Iran, against North Korea, against the Maduro regime in Venezuela. We've imposed what we call maximum pressure campaigns. All those regimes are still standing. The economic life of the countries has been affected. But, you know, when you live in an authoritarian society, it's the life of the rulers that matters. And Vladimir Putin's lifestyle is not going to be affected by Western sanctions. So I think, and I've been a strong supporter of sanctions. I favor every sanction that the West has imposed on Russia. I would have imposed a lot more, but I think we've got to be coldly realistic about the prospects for sustained change, especially compared with the faltering of resolve that I worry about, particularly in Europe, but in the US as well.
Ambassador, I want to ask you, you've been a diplomat all your life. You've dealt very closely with Vladimir Putin, both as national security advisor and, of course, before that, as ambassador of the United States to the UN. What sort of person is he? What's in his mind? What keeps him going? I'm just trying to find a logical explanation to get inside the head of the man.
Right. Well, look, I think he's reflects his KGB training. He thinks in very methodical fashion. He knows what he needs to know. And I think maybe most important of all, he knows what he thinks Russia's national interests are. He's got a very clear view of that. And as I say, he saw the collapse of the Soviet Union as a tragedy. And he wants to go down in history as the man who reversed it. Now, it's possible to be coldly rational and wrong. You can make mistakes. And certainly the way this war has been conducted, we're now in its 7th day, so it's early, but has not gone well for Russia, has not gone well at all. This was the Soviet army we feared in the Cold War. They're running out of food and gas 75 miles into Ukraine. So there clearly mistakes have been made, but I think it's a mistake to lapse into this psychoanalytic process about, well, maybe he's looking at his age, or maybe he's got a disease, or maybe he's been in a COVID bubble. It's much better not to assume your adversary is suffering from some psychoanalytic weakness, and just try and understand what mistakes they've been made and how to apply more pressure. If there's evidence of some kind of mental problem with Putin, I'd be open to receiving it. But I think theorizing about it can be dangerous.
When you look at how this war has played out over the last 7 days, and it's clear, every war since the end of the Second World War, there has been some form of brokered solution, some form of negotiated settlement. What is it that NATO can offer Vladimir Putin? And again, like you said, it hasn't exactly gone according to plan for him. And if he's looking for a face saver, if he's looking for a way out, what is it that NATO can offer him in a way that we can at least put an end to these hostilities?
Yeah, well, I think he thought this was going to go much more quickly than it has. I think he believed that most of his strategic objectives would be achieved by now. That's obviously not the case. But I think at this moment, he's in the double down mode. He's got the honor of the Russian military at stake here and its reputation for effectiveness. And that reputation's been burned very badly. So I think he's going to continue with his military operations. And I also think the West is really not speaking from a position of strength, at least relative strength at this point. There are conflicting reports about the level of damage done to the Russian economy. I think the damage will be significant. But as I say, we've imposed significant damage on other economies, and they're still there. So I don't want to overstate what the effect will be, especially if your calculus of the value of human life or what hardship is worth is different than you see in democratic countries. So I don't think we're at the point of negotiation yet. I think, unfortunately, once this violence is started, there has to be more, and I think the West needs to do more in terms of arming and equipping the Ukrainians, give them more anti-tank javelins, give them more ammunition. As Zelensky said a couple of days ago when he was being urged to leave Kiev and go to safety, said, "I don't need a ride, I need more ammunition." I think that's what we ought to get to.
Coming back to Putin, he's been in power for the last 20 years now. There is a view that the West also played a very critical role in the development of Vladimir Putin, in making him who he is today. Do you think over the last decades of dealing with him, the West underestimated him severely, or it gave him too much of leeway? I go back to those statements of Russian reset 10 years ago, which just flattered to deceive. Did the West completely fail in making sure that even if he had ambitions, those ambitions had to be curtailed within a rules-based order? And if it is not, then there is a cost to pay, a military cost to pay for it.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure he cares about a rules-based order. I think that's one of our problems. I don't think Xi Jinping cares about a rules-based order unless he writes the rules. So I think we need to get used to that. I think the problem goes back before Putin. I think in the 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union at the end of 1991, remember, people were talking about the end of history, and we had the peace dividend. Defense budgets in the West in particular were cut dramatically. It turned out history wasn't over, the threats weren't over, and but in that period of euphoria, I think we lost a huge number of opportunities in Russia as they tried to break away from 80 years of authoritarian rule and communist economic policies and all the rest. It seemed like the opportunities were enormous, but we didn't think through the animosities that also developed from the collapse of the Soviet Union. We didn't fully understand it. And so I think what I would say about the West behavior is we didn't pay enough attention. We didn't see this coming. We didn't think through exactly what the expansion of NATO was going to imply. We didn't adequately address how to bring Russia into the Western community as part of Europe, which everybody talked about. And Russian resentment grew, and I'm not blaming anybody in particular. I'm blaming the mood of the times. I'm not sure by the time Putin became president of Russia and had the authority in his hands that his attitude at that point could be changed. I think he had a pretty well-formed idea of what he wanted already.
Last couple of questions. The Indian government seems to have taken a neutral, if not a nuanced position. It abstained at the vote of the United Nations Security Council. At the same time, it is said that war is not an option. Both parties need to come to the dialogue table quickly. What would you say to the way in which the Indian authorities have approached this?
Well, to me, this is part of the problem of how to get a more sustained US-India strategic conversation going. I think there's been a lot of progress with the Quad, with India, the US, Japan, and Australia. I think now if my formulation or others are very similar about this Russia-China entente, or whatever you want to call it, this relationship, there's a lot going on in the world, and it's changing in ways that 1 or 2 years ago, I don't think were entirely foreseeable. But I don't think the approach toward international affairs that Russia and China show is compatible, certainly with the best interest of the United States, and I would suggest not with the best interest of India either. So I wish India's position was more aligned with the US in this case, no doubt about it. I think it would be more effective, but I also know from experience in dealing with Indian leaders and others that there's a lot of talking that has to happen here, and a lot of understanding about each other's position The hope would be we can move forward together. It's a time-consuming process, and in politics, the urgent often crowds out the important. But if Ukraine tells us anything, it's time for more intense discussion, not just bilaterally, but with Japan, with Australia, with many others too.
And a final word, you've been National Security Advisor to Mr. Trump, and I know both of you have not necessarily been on the same page all the time. There are people, including Trump himself, who's been saying this past week that had he been president, he would have dealt with this and responded differently. What's your take on that?
No, I've said I think the Russians would have been Kiev long ago. I think Trump badly mishandled relations with Ukraine during the period when he was so concerned about his own political future that he was threatening to withhold $250 million of U.S. security assistance. I think it interjected Ukraine into the American political debate with very negative consequences. Trump barely knew where Ukraine was. He certainly didn't think strategically about it. And I think his affinity for Putin, especially in a second term, would not have led him to oppose it. I think, look, what Donald Trump says today is whatever Biden is doing, he's doing it wrong, and I would have done it better. And I say that myself as somebody who's very critical of pretty much most of Biden's international policies. But this is Trump being Trump. If he were there, things would be perfect. And that's just the way he sees the world, not because he has a policy to achieve it, but because he's Donald Trump.
Okay. Ambassador John Bolton, as always, for not pulling back your punches and for your very, very thoughtful insights into what's going on between Russia and Ukraine. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you for having me.